Hi everyone, and thank you for joining today's Sprintax non-resident tax webinar. Everything you need to know about non-resident tax for J1 visa holders. My name is Anna Fitzpatrick and I'm an account manager here at Sprintax. And the aim of today's session is to bring you through everything you might need to know about non-resident tax as we move through the 2023 US tax filing season. Before we start, just some general housekeeping. You may notice that the webinar is muted to attendees. That's just to help us deal with attendee numbers and background noise and things like that. But if you do have any questions, thoughts, or feedback, feel free to use the questions box and we'll get to questions throughout the session and common themes towards the end. What I will say is that many of your questions may be answered as we move through today's content. So maybe wait until we get to your topic area. And if your question isn't answered, feel free to avail of the questions box. This session is also being recorded, so we will send the recording out to all registrations and all attendees to the email that you registered for the session with. Also, because it is tax that we're talking about, we generally have to start off with some type of a disclaimer. And this presentation is aiming to give everyone a general understanding of tax as it applies to non-resident J1 visa holders in the US. So we'd always say that tax is a little bit like your own DNA, and although you may seem nearly identical on paper to your fellow J1 visa holders, one minor detail could make you be treated completely differently for tax purposes. So with that said, it's always important to keep in mind that each individual has their own unique tax position and is responsible for their own tax determination and tax compliance. But looking at what we'll aim to cover in today's session, we'll look at an overview of tax for non-residents on J1 visas. So looking at things like residency for tax purposes, important dates this season, who needs to file, for example. We'll also look at guidance around employment and receiving US income for non-residents, specifically looking at things like FICA taxes and tax treaties. We'll look at understanding the implications of filing an incorrect tax return and what it looks like if you don't file or you misfile and how to go about amending that. And then lastly, using Sprintax to assist with your tax compliance. When we're looking at the US tax filing season, generally a good place to start is around the important dates. And when we're looking at the 2023 tax filing season, we're looking back on the 2023 tax year. So we're looking at the period of January 1st to December 31st, 2023. And we're looking back on that, any presents that you had in the US, any income that you received, any taxes that were withheld on that income. And ultimately, we're looking to see if you might have over or perhaps underpaid tax to the IRS or to the state tax authorities. The very important date is the tax filing deadline, which stands at April 15th, 2024. So it's important to make sure that you're preparing and filing your taxes well ahead of the April deadline. Residency for tax purposes then is definitely a concept that can confuse a lot of individuals on J1 visas, so I'll break it down a little bit for everyone. The first important thing to mention is that residency for tax purposes is going to be independent of your visa or immigration status. So generally for J1 visa holders on as an intern trainee, summer work travel, camp counselor, au pair, teacher or researcher, you're typically automatically considered a non-resident for tax purposes for 2 out of the last 6 calendar years preceding the current year in the US. So as a non-resident, you're generally going to be taxed differently to that of a resident alien, and you might have to prepare different tax forms, for example, to make sure that you're taxed correctly. Then if you've been in the US for longer than that 2-year period as one of those J1 visa holders, the IRS will generally use the substantial presence test to determine your residency for tax purposes. And essentially, this test looks back on the previous 3 years and it's looking at a calculation of your days of presence in order to figure out, are you a resident or are you a non-resident for tax purposes? And essentially, the substantial presence test will take all of the days of presence in the US for the current year, then it will take a third of the days of presence in the US before the current year, and a sixth of days of presence in the year before that. And if that totals to over 183 days, then you would be deemed a resident for tax purposes. Good news there is that if you're using Sprintax returns to prepare your taxes this season, the system will automatically determine your residency, and if you are a resident, the system will let you know and will point you in the direction of TurboTax. This is just a useful residency summary table with some of the common visa types, as well as the number of years that you'd be exempt from the substantial presence test, or the number of years of non-resident status that you'd have, as well as some details on FICA exemption, which I'll touch on in more detail in a couple of slides. A big question then is who actually needs to file for 2023, and what are your filing requirements as a J1 visa holder? Importantly, every non-resident has some type of IRS filing application, and generally every non-resident needs to do something. The minimum is typically going to be Form 8843, and this form needs to be filed by any F, J, M, or Q visa holders who were present on US soil as a non-resident for tax purposes. And importantly, it needs to be filed even if you didn't earn any income during the tax year. But I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But in many cases, and in particular for those on J1 visas, you may be receiving taxable income during the tax year. So maybe you're getting taxable wages or a stipend, for example. And as there's no personal exemption amount for 2023 for non-residents, if you earn anything over $0 of taxable US sourced income, this is generally going to trigger a federal filing requirement, which would be the 1040 NOR for non-residents. Then for anyone who was here a couple of years back, you may have seen or been familiar with the 1040 NOR Easy, but this has been discontinued since the 2020 tax season. But just looking at the 8843 in a little bit more detail, as I mentioned, it's generally the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents who are present on US soil under an F, J, M, or Q visa status. It needs to be filed even if you didn't earn any income, but also if you did earn income, it needs to be filed alongside your 1040 NOR. It's a pretty simple form. It's going to ask you for some basic general personal information, as well as details of your days of presence in the US. And ultimately, it's letting the IRS know that you're a non-resident for tax purposes for this tax year and not to count your days of presence towards a substantial presence test. It is a part of your tax record, so it's important to make sure that you are preparing and filing this form for each year that you trigger the filing requirement of the 8843. This is a common question we get from a lot of J1 visa holders. What income does not trigger a filing requirement for non-residents? So the first is money transferred from parents and relatives overseas. So if you receive money from a parent or a relative from overseas, from your home country perhaps, to assist you with the cost of living when you're in the US, generally as that's coming from outside the US, it's typically going to be considered foreign sourced income, and as a non-resident for tax purposes, you're generally only taxed on and required to report your US sourced income, and as a result, it shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US. The second example then is income earned in your home country. So maybe you had a job before moving to the US and you're still receiving your last payslip or paycheck. Maybe you have a rental property in your home country and you're receiving rental income. That's similar to the first example in that if this income is coming from your home country, and as long as it's considered foreign sourced income, and as long as you are a non-resident for tax purposes, it shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for you as a non-resident in the US. Third example, interest on your regular savings account. Although this may be a very small amount, it also shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. Lastly, this may not apply to many J1 visa holders, but just to include it just in case, if you got a scholarship, fellowship, grant, targeted grant, achievement award for activities conducted outside the US, this is generally considered foreign sourced income. And as I've touched on a couple of times, if you are a non-resident for tax purposes, you're generally only taxed on and required to report your US sourced income. And just to mention, if anyone became a resident for tax purposes, you would be taxed on and required to report your worldwide income. This is a very important slide around some of the income documents that you might receive to report the income that you received during the tax year. So we have the W-2, the 1040 US, and the 1099 series. The W-2 is probably going to be the most common. It's generally going to outline wages, salary, or compensation that you earned during the tax year, as well as any taxes that were withheld on that income. And if you're due to receive a W-2, generally the deadline to receive one for the 2023 tax year would be by January 31st, 2024. The 1042S can be another common one to report things like maybe taxable scholarships, stipends. If you were tax-free exempt and you received tax-free exempt income, this would generally be reportable on a 1042S, maybe prizes, awards, royalty payments, for example. And the deadline to receive a 1042S, if you're due to receive one, would be by March 15th, 2024. The 1099 series documents, then, these should be less common for non-residents, but you might receive one maybe if your employer or the withholder wasn't aware of your non-resident tax position, and they might issue a 1099 to report things like rental income, investment income, commissions, for example. And generally the deadline to receive a 1099, if you're due one, would be by the end of March. So importantly, if you receive one or multiple income documents, you will need them all to report them on your one individual income tax return. Just a quick note on non-resident spouses and dependents then. So there are no joint returns for non-residents. If you are a non-resident and you have a non-resident spouse or you have non-resident dependents, you would need to file separately. The obligations remain much of what we've discussed up to this point. The minimum is generally going to be the 8843. If you've both received taxable income, you would likely need to file the 1040 NR, and you may have state tax filing requirements depending on the state and depending on your circumstances. And also just to mention that each dependent would need to mail their forms in separate envelopes. But where that differs is if a non-resident is actually married to a resident, you can elect to file jointly on your resident spouse's tax return. But we would recommend always doing the math on both options first to see which is the most favourable for your personal tax position. So up to this point, when I've talked about things like residency for tax purposes and who needs to file for 2023, that has been on the federal side of things. And when it comes to the state tax side, states have their own individual state tax rules and state residency rules. Some will only say you need to file if you earn over a certain threshold. Others will say you'll need to file from the very first dollar. So it will just vary from state to state. If you're using the Sprintax system, the system will determine if you need to file state or not for one or multiple states, depending on your circumstances, and Sprintax will have the option then of preparing your state tax return for you. Then moving on to employment and receiving US income during the tax year. FICA taxes is going to be an important consideration here. And for anyone who's not familiar with FICA taxes, it's also known as Social Security and Medicare. And it's essentially a tax that is paid into that will assist you with the cost of healthcare when you get to a certain age. But in the eyes of the IRS, as a non-resident for tax purposes on a J1 visa, you generally won't be in the US long enough under that visa type to enjoy the benefits of that tax. And as a result, non-residents for tax purposes on J1 visas should not be paying FICA. Now, it's not a blanket rule. If you were on a H1B, a J2, or a TN visa, you would be subject to FICA from the first day of your employment. And also, if you became a resident for tax purposes, you would be subject to FICA taxes. So what we can often see in the cases of J1 visa holders is maybe there's only a handful of non-residents, or maybe you're the only non-resident with your employer. Maybe they're not aware of this and they might withhold FICA incorrectly from your pay. If that happens, there are opportunities to claim it back. The first would be to reach out to your employer and request the FICA refund from them. And if they refuse, you can apply for the refund using Form 843 and 8316. And just in terms of seeing if you've been paying FICA or Social Security and Medicare, you'll see this on your W-2, and also you'll see it on any pay slips or pay stubs that you may have received. But just looking at the comparison of the impact of FICA taxes on employees and what it can look like if you do have FICA withheld incorrectly. It can result in a significant amount of tax being withheld that ultimately didn't need to be withheld. So if we look at the case of the F1 student earning $20,000 in wages, they're a non-resident, but maybe their J1 employer wasn't aware of that and they withheld FICA incorrectly. That resulted in over $1,500 being withheld that ultimately didn't need to be withheld. This, there are opportunities to claim it back. If the employer refuses, that's your first option. If they refuse, you go to the IRS. But this really highlights the importance of making sure that your employer is aware of your personal tax position from the get-go and from the point of payment to make sure that you're taxed correctly and save you any hassle or long wait times trying to get refunds back. Tax treaties then can have another impact, and they're an important consideration. The US has income tax treaties with 66 foreign countries that aim to reduce the taxation on certain types of income, or in some cases, exempt income from tax entirely. And whether you are eligible or not will generally be based off 5 factors: your visa type, the country of residence that you're from, the income type that you're receiving, the type of work that you're being compensated for, or the type of payer of the income or type of employer, and the duration of time in the US. It can be tricky figuring out if you need to, or if you are eligible for a tax treaty or not, as well as what tax forms you need to provide to the employer to allow you to claim that tax treaty. So I'll touch on it a little bit later on, but we do have a separate system called Sprintax forms that can help with all things on the pre-employment side, including determining treaty eligibility. Also important to mention that only some states will honour the provisions of US tax treaties. So moving then on to the implications of misfiling and not filing. So maybe you're listening to this webinar, you're realizing you were here last year, you didn't file a tax return, maybe you were here a couple of years back and you didn't file. We'd always say don't panic, but do set the record straight. So if you've never filed, maybe you were here back in 2021, you didn't hear about having to file, you forgot to file, you can catch up and back file at any stage. And we would recommend doing so as soon as possible. And the good news there is that if you're due a tax refund in the last 3 years, the IRS are happy to issue that to you as well. Then if you've misfiled, so maybe you were a non-resident for tax purposes, but you used TurboTax, for example, and TurboTax only help with resident taxes. So if you were a non-resident and you used TurboTax, you would have actually misfiled. And if that is the case, you would need to file an amended tax return using the 1040X, the amended US individual income tax return, and you need to file the amended return for all incorrect years or for all misfiled years. Get from J1s and non-residents in general is what are the implications of not filing, or what happens if I don't file or misfile? Well, as you know, as a non-resident, you're required to comply with all US laws, including that of the IRS, and filing any tax forms. Being compliant is also part of maintaining your visa status. And also, one that we've highlighted there and that we really continue to emphasize is the impact that it could have on your future immigration status. So maybe you're thinking of staying in the US, maybe you're thinking of applying for a change of status to H1B or an LPR visa, for example. And really, tax is one of the easiest things to pull up if someone is compliant or not. And we would hate to see tax being anything that would prevent anyone from staying in the US or returning to the US. So that's where the tax compliance message is key here, and making sure that you do file a compliant return for all years that you file or trigger a filing requirement. On top of that, then, if the IRS are owed money, they're going to want that back and chase for it. And on top of that, fines and penalties and interest can build up on that if the IRS are owed. And also, you might actually be missing out on a tax refund. Just a quick note then to be careful about any options that are being recommended to you. So, first thing to mention here is TurboTax. TurboTax are a great company. We work with TurboTax. Our residency staff will figure out if you're a resident, and if you are, we'll send you to TurboTax to file a resident tax return. But TurboTax can only support residents. If you're a non-resident for tax purposes, you cannot use TurboTax because it would be misfiling, and you would end up filing a resident return, and you then need to go about amending your return. We helped over 12,000 non-residents to amend their returns over the last 3 years. So if you are falling into that category, you're not alone, but it is important to make sure that you are amending your return if you filed incorrectly. Then also just a quick note about social media groups. We often see a lot of social media groups recommending certain individuals or maybe companies, for example. And in a lot of those cases, particularly with those individuals claiming they can file your return for you and get you the maximum refund, etc. In those cases, we often see that these individuals are actually misfiling and claiming credits and deductions that you're not entitled to. And in that case, it would be a case of misfiling. So it'd be important to do your due diligence and make sure that you are, finding an appropriate company to file a compliant and correct tax return. Then just wanting to show you some of the Sprintax resources that we have for non-resident tax. One that I mentioned around the tax treaty piece was Sprintax forms. So this system can help on the pre-employment side of things with everything from determining your residency for tax purposes, determining if you should be exempt from FICA or not, your tax treaty eligibility, generating tax forms like your W4, 8233, and W8 Ben. And ultimately, it would just be a matter of you printing those forms, signing them, and providing them to your employer to help make sure you're taxed correctly on your income. So important to mention, this is separate to any end of year filing that you might need to do. It is on the pre-employment side, and end of year filing would be more so focused on Sprintax returns, which I'll touch on now. Many of you may receive communication from a sponsor, agent, employer, any institution really, with regard to Sprintax. And if you receive any link or code, please follow the instructions coming from your institution. If you follow the link, you'll go to the login page. You can log in or set up an account if you haven't used this before. Then we get into the tax-based questionnaire. So you'll firstly select the tax year that you need assistance with, which is likely going to be 2023. And then we get into residency. So we need to figure out, are you a resident or are you a non-resident for tax purposes? So here we'll be asking you about your first ever visit to the US, current visit, previous visits, entry and exit types, visa types, and if you are a non-resident for tax purposes, the system will simply let you continue to the next step. But if you've been here long enough to be a resident for tax purposes, the system will stop you at this point, let you know, and point you in the direction of TurboTax to file a resident tax return. But that's only if we've determined that you are a resident for tax purposes. Then you'll be asked received US income. If you say yes, we'll ask you what income documents you have and the quantity of each, and you'll be able to upload them or manually enter them into your Sprintax account. You'll also see that there's support on the bottom right hand corner of that screenshot there. So we do have access to our FAQs there, but also importantly, access to our 24/7 live chat, where you'll be able to reach out to our support team if you do have any questions moving through the questionnaire. As well as helping with things like the 8843 and your federal tax returns, the system can also help with state taxes. So we can figure out if you need to file state or not. If the system thinks you need to file state, we might ask some additional questions surrounding the state tax law in that state. And then if you do need to file state, we'll let you know, and you'll have the option of using Sprintax to prepare your state tax return. Then you will reach the order breakdown. So we'll give you a summary of the services that have been provided here. So you might have a federal return, you may have a state tax return, and if you've received any discount code, this would be where you would enter it and validate it. Once you enter any code or make any payment, we'll generate your tax returns. So on the federal side, we do offer federal e-filing for anyone who is eligible to e-file their federal return. If you are eligible, that's great. We'll give you the option and you'll proceed with e-file authentication. But the IRS have certain limitations that mean that certain individuals won't be eligible to e-file. If you aren't eligible, we won't give you the option because it simply wouldn't be accepted by the IRS. But if you aren't eligible to e-file your federal return, we'll give you a tax pack with your completed tax forms as well as instructions on next steps outlining to print, sign and mail them to the address provided. Also, state tax returns would still need to be mailed. Again, you'll get a tax pack with detailed instructions. And if you just had Form 8843 on its own, that would need to be mailed. But again, instructions will all be provided. Lastly, then, just touching on some other support. So we have lots and lots of educational videos on YouTube, so feel free to check out our YouTube channel. We also have tons of blogs for tax awareness, some specifically for individuals on certain visa types, particularly those on J1 visas, so you may be able to find one that's catered just to you. We also have our 24/7 live chat that I've touched on and Sprintax forums, and we'll be hosting a series of these webinars, so tax workshops and webinars just like these. So keep an eye out for any further communications on these workshops and webinars. But with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today's session. I really hope you found it helpful, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your day and joining and trying to learn a little bit more about non-resident tax. I know we probably had a lot of questions, and likely I've had colleagues in the background taking a look at these throughout, but I'm just going to take a look at any outstanding questions and maybe some common themes that we saw in the questions box as well.
Hi Anna, it's Alvira here, the Sprintax team. I've just been in the background answering questions as we've gone through, so I'm happy to look through any outstanding questions now and cover those off. So question here, what do I do if I'm a trainee but I have been receiving income? My employer was not filing my taxes. So if you've received income, you should receive an income document from that employer. You should receive a W-2 form. If you haven't received that yet, definitely reach out to the employer and request a copy of that. You will need that when you're sitting down to prepare your taxes yourself. So yeah, reach out and request a copy of that W-2. What if I don't have any tax documents like 1099 or W-2? So I suppose it's important to be aware that not everybody will receive all income documents. So there's three different types of income documents, we'll say. One is the W-2, which would be for wages or salary. If you've worked for an employer, you generally receive a W-2 to report the income and the tax that was withheld and so on that income. Another one would be a 1042-S document, and that document is generally used to report taxable scholarships, stipends, royalty payments, grants, prizes, awards, tax treaty exempt income would be on a 1042-S document. Or if you had maybe investment income or rental income, for example, that would be reported on a 1099 document. But not everybody will receive all of those documents. You'll only receive the ones that are relevant to you. So you say, what do I do if I don't receive documents like 1099 or W-2? If you didn't have any miscellaneous income, we'll say, or if you didn't have employment income, you won't receive those documents. If you had no income at all, you won't receive any income documents. But I'm expecting, since we're on a J1 session today, I assume probably most of you have received some form of income and would have received some income documents. You will need to have your income documents to hand when you're sitting down to prepare your taxes. But again, it'll only be the income documents that are relevant to you. If you're unsure, if you worked for an employer and you haven't received any income document yet, you should have received it by now. If you haven't, just reach out to them and ask them, they'll be able to give you a copy of that. If we held multiple positions in the US in 2023, can we file for all those positions at the same time on a single form? Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, absolutely. So once you reach the income details section on Sprintax, we'll have asked you, have you received income in the US? What type of income have you received? What income documents have you received? So say, for example, you worked for 3 different employers in 2023. You'd expect to receive a W-2 from each one of those. So you'd have 3 different W-2 documents. Or maybe you had a taxable scholarship and you've got a 1042S for that, or maybe you had rental income and you've got a 1099 for that. So whatever you've got, you'll be able to upload that information in the income details section. You know, in that page that Anna showed earlier where you'll upload your documents, you can simply upload a digital version of your document and do that for each one that you've received. And we'll be able to include all of that then. We'll work out then exactly what your filing obligations are, and we will prepare the relevant forms for you. So yeah, absolutely, just provide the details from all of your income documents there in that income details section, and we'll do the rest. Somebody asking, where can I send the form? So I assume you're talking about the tax forms that are prepared for you once you go through Sprintax. So I suppose I see there has been some questions there on e-filing as well. So kind of what I'll do is I'll answer both those questions in this piece. But if you qualify to e-file, so if you meet the IRS criteria to e-file, Sprintax will recognise that and will provide you with that option. You'll see an option on that screen towards the end where it says proceed with e-file. Now, if it's a case you don't meet the IRS criteria to e-file, we won't offer that option to you. You won't see that. You'll just see the option to download your tax pack. Now, if it's a case you don't qualify to e-file, it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. Unfortunately, there are some IRS criteria that would stop you from e-filing. So things like if you didn't have a social security number and you just have an ITIN, you couldn't e-file. If your W-2 form didn't have a control number, or if your 1042S didn't have a unique code identifier, there's a number of different limitations there that would stop you from e-filing. Now, we do have a detailed blog post on e-filing, everything you need to know about e-filing, including those IRS limitations. So if you'd like to learn a little more about that, just go to the Sprintax blog, type in e-file, and we'll give you that blog post. You'll find some useful information there. But in terms of where to send your documents then, if it's a case you need to print your documents, we'll give you that tax pack. So we'll give you the completed tax pack with a cover letter that outlines what your next steps are. And in there, we'll give you the address that you need to send your forms to. So do pay attention to that. The address can vary depending on whether you are due a refund or whether you owe money to the IRS. The address can be different then as to where you're sending your forms. So it is really important that you do review the cover letter that we provide, follow those instructions, and get your documents mailed then to the relevant department. Let's have a look, see what else has come through. So also for previous positions, we may not have filed correctly. Can we also use Sprintax for those positions? So yeah, if it's a case you filed incorrectly in the past, you can certainly submit an amended tax return, which is the 1040X, along with a correct non-resident tax return. Sprintax will definitely be able to help you with that. So if you need to catch up, we'll say, if you missed a year, you didn't file at all, you were in the US and didn't realize you needed to do anything, or if you need to correct a year that you filed incorrectly, you can certainly do both on Sprintax. So to catch up on a year that you haven't filed, you can just simply go into your Sprintax account or create an account if you haven't used Sprintax before, select the year that you want to file, answer the questions based on that year, and do that for each year that you need to catch up on. If you need to correct a year that you filed incorrectly, then you just again log into your Sprintax account, choose the year, then click the little box underneath that says, I need to amend a tax return that I've already submitted to the IRS. We'll guide you through the process then. We'll prepare that amended tax return, and it's just a case of getting that submitted. So I had a J1 visa. Do I have to file for 2022 if I only worked November and December? Yes, absolutely. So even if you didn't work and you were just present in the US in November and December, you'd need to submit Form 8843, which is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US. But if you've worked and you've earned income, you will definitely trigger a federal filing requirement, which is the 1040NR, and you may also trigger a state filing requirement depending on your situation. But again, Sprintax will work all of that out for you. So once you provide your information through the Sprintax questionnaire, we'll do the calculations, we'll work out what your filing obligations are, and we'll prepare all relevant forms for you. But yes, even if it was only for 2 months, and I know I did answer a question earlier on where somebody had arrived in the US on December 31st and 2023 and wondered did they need to file. And yes, the answer is you absolutely do. Even if it was just for 1 day, and if you didn't receive any income, you still need to complete that form 8843 if you were present in the US on an F, J, M or Q visa. It is part of your visa conditions. It's something that you do need to do. I filed with TurboTax before. How do I correct that? Yeah, so that's very straightforward. Just select the year that you want to amend. Tick the box underneath that says I need to amend a tax return that I've already submitted to the IRS, and we'll go through the motions with you. We'll get the information that's needed and we'll prepare that form. How do I get a W-2 as an au pair? So I suppose that's different in that case. Most au pairs will not receive a W-2. You know, you'll have received income from your host family or your employer, but you won't receive that W-2 form. So what we'd say is keep record of the income that you receive. You know, maybe keep a notebook or a diary or whatever of payments that you receive each week or each month or however often you receive them. You could use things like your bank statements to show payments that you've received. You know, it is different for an au pair. You know, you won't receive that W-2, but you will be able to provide details of your income in other ways. Let's see. So California residency determination, do you have any income earned or received outside the US? So I suppose in terms of income outside the US, the reason we ask that is because as a non-resident, you know, you won't need to report any income that you've received from outside the US. Now, state tax rules differ and they're different from state to state, you know, so it could be that California residency rules are different in terms of income received from outside the state. But the software is, you know, the software has all of that logic built into it. So Sprintax, when we ask you these questions and you provide this information, we will be able to work out exactly what your filing obligations are. And if you did trigger a state filing obligation, and we'll prepare the relevant forms for you. But important to be aware that the state rules do differ from state to state, and it can be quite complicated, but you don't need to worry about it because Sprintax will work all of that out for you. Okay, does a visit to the US on vacation via an ESTA in the past not need to be included on the residency status slide when it asks about first visit to the US? No, that should be included, even a visit on an ESTA, you know, so it's not just your first visit on your current visa, it is your very first visit. So that may have been, you know, when you visited Disneyland with your family when you were a kid. You know, so it is important to put in your very first visit to the US, not just on your current visa, your very first visit, and then we'll ask you for details of all of your visits since then. So it is important to provide details of all of your visits in and out of the US so that we can correctly determine if you're resident or non-resident for tax. Now, I know that can be complicated, and especially if you've been in and out of the US a lot over the years, but you can visit i94.gov, which will give you some of your recent travel history. I think that goes back something like 10 years. Prior to that, what we'd say is check your old passports, see if your dates are in there. Maybe check with family members, see do they know the dates. And worst case scenario, if, for example, you know you visited the US 15 years ago for 2 weeks on family vacation, but you don't know the exact dates. Well, in that case, just enter a 2-week period in that year. If the dates aren't exact, that's okay, but do allow for a 2-week period. So, you know, account for the number of days that you've spent in the US. Where do I get Form 8843 and what is the 1040 NR for? So Form 8843 is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US. So even if you didn't receive any income at all, you need to submit Form 8843. That's a form that Sprintax will prepare for you. So once you fill in your information through the Sprintax questionnaire, we will prepare all relevant forms for you, including Form 8843. Form 1040 NR then is the federal tax form. So if you've received any US income at all over $0, then you will need to submit a federal return, which is the 1040 NR. Now, if you trigger that federal filing requirement, if you've received income and you do trigger that filing requirement, then Form 8843 will be included as part of that, because, like I said, Form 8843 is the minimum filing requirement for everyone. So all of you on today's session, if you were present in the US in 2023 for any time, even if it was only a day, even if you didn't receive any income, you will need to submit at least Form 8843. But if you did receive any income at all, any US source income over $0, then you will trigger the federal filing requirement. And in that case, Form 8843 will be included with that. You may also trigger a state filing requirement, but again, that depends on your situation. And as I said, the state rules differ from state to state. But again, Sprintax will work that out for you. My employer didn't fill my W-2. Does that mean I have to fill it out on my own? So no, the W-2 is an income document and your employer should provide that to you. So if you haven't received that, the deadline to receive a W-2 was actually January 31st, 2024 for the 2023 tax year. So if you're expecting that and you haven't received it, definitely reach out and request a copy of that. They will be able to send that over to you. But again, as I said, it's different for au pairs. You know, you won't receive a W-2 most likely as an au pair, and you can report your income then in other ways. We will be able to guide you through that. Do we have some sort of calculation on how much we would be taxed based on our 2023 income? So yeah, Sprintax will work that out for you. So once you provide your information in that Sprintax questionnaire, as you get closer to the end, we'll give you your summary. So we'll tell you exactly if there's a refund there, we'll tell you how much that is. If it's a case you owe tax to the IRS, we'll outline that for you there as well. So we'll give you the full outline of what your situation is. Can I deduct my stepdaughter's college tuition from my taxes? Unfortunately not. As a non-resident, there's very little you can claim in terms of deductions or expenses. And no, unfortunately, it's not something you will be able to claim as a non-resident. So I'm filling out my visits to the US and previously was an F1 student prior to 2023. However, most of my visits during that period did not have a departure date logged on I-94 travel history. What am I supposed to do in this situation? So I suppose, you know, if you do you know your departure dates? If you have those, just enter that information in step 1. In terms of the date you plan to leave, that is a question that we do ask. What is the date of your planned departure or whatever? If it's a case you haven't planned your departure date yet, in that question you can actually put the expiry date of your visa. I'm an au pair and I am here 3 months. I have to pay my taxes one time this date until April 15th. So I suppose 3 months, did you only arrive in the US in 2024 or did you spend any time in the US in 2023? So if you arrived, say, in December 2023, you will need to submit at least Form 8843 for the 2023 tax year. But if you only arrived, say, after January 1st this year, then you don't need to do anything until this time next year. You'll need to file for 2024, which will be done this time next year. At the moment, what we're filing for is the 2023 tax year, and that does need to be submitted by April 15th. I'm a German citizen. I had a J1 visa. Is my income exempt by tax treaty? It's very hard to answer a question like this on a session like a question like that on a session like this without asking you a ton of other questions. But Sprintax will work that out for you. So if you go in and fill in your details there, we will check to see if there is a tax treaty exemption available for you, and that will certainly be included if there is. I only have W-2 form. Do I need another form to do federal income taxes? On the website are requesting one. It provides 3 options. So if you've only received a W-2, if that was your only source of income, then that's all you need. You only need to include that W-2 on the income details section, and we'll work everything out and prepare the relevant forms for you. Again, how do I calculate my taxes? Sprintax will work that out for you. Just provide your information there and we'll do all the calculations. Okay. Hi, I'm a J1 married to another J1. Should we file our taxes separately? Our kids live with us and have an ITIN number. Should both of us include them in our taxes? Okay, so the big thing here is as non-residents, you can't file jointly. You have to file separately. So you will need to file separate returns. In terms of your kids, you won't be able to claim child tax credits or anything like that for them as non-residents. You won't be entitled to claim child tax credits, but you can certainly prepare the dependent form 8843 for them in Sprintax. So in one of the steps in Sprintax, we'll ask you for the information about your kids and we'll prepare the dependent form 8843 for you when we're preparing your tax forms as well. So they'll be included in your tax pack. Okay. I did my taxes last Saturday through Sprintax. I filed, but my 1042S form, and then Sprintax showed me a federal tax and state tax to pay, plus the $17 Sprintax form. I made the payment. Am I done with taxes? Okay, so if you've gone through the process, we've prepared the forms for you, you've paid any fee or whatever was needed there, you need to make sure you download your tax pack and follow those instructions. So, just because you get to that end stage, you pay your fee, that's not the end. You do need to download the tax pack, you need to print those forms, you need to sign them, and you need to mail them to the relevant department. Now, if you qualified to e-file, your federal return would be e-filed. But if you've got a state filing requirement, or if you had Form 8843 on its own, they will always need to be physically mailed. So if you're unsure, just log back into your Sprintax account, go to your tax pack, download that. We'll give you the instructions in the cover letter. But do certainly go back and have a look. Don't just assume that you're done, because it may be that those forms will need to be mailed. What if I didn't receive any income documents? Am I still on time to ask my employer and then apply for a tax refund? Yes, absolutely. Your employer may be able to issue your income documents by email. If you request that now, you may have it in a couple of hours, and you can certainly sit down and prepare your taxes. You have until April 15th to get those tax returns submitted. It'll take you about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, depending on how quick you go through the Sprintax process. But in general, say 20 to 30 minutes, you'll have your tax return submitted. But do it sooner rather than later. If you've got your income documents, don't wait until closer to that deadline. The sooner you do it, the sooner you'll receive any refund that you may be due. As you can imagine, the closer we get to that tax filing deadline, the busier the IRS and the state departments are going to be, and the longer it's going to take to process your return. So I came here to the US on December 8th. I'll be here for 1 year. Should I have to pay tax right now or just the next dates? So if you arrived on December 8th, you will definitely need to submit something for 2023. If you didn't receive any income, it'll just be Form 8843. But if you did receive any income between December 8th and December 31st, then you will trigger a federal filing requirement and maybe a state filing requirement too. But again, Sprintax will work all of that out for you. Let me see. So we've got another couple of minutes. Let's try and get through as much as I can. So if I only had income from my home country and not US sourced, and am I non-resident and only have to send Form 8843 without using Sprintax online? So I suppose the one thing to know here, it's really important to be aware if you are resident or non-resident for tax. If you're non-resident for tax and your only source of income was from outside the US, then it is just Form 8843 you need to submit. And you can do that, like Sprintax will prepare that form for you, of course, but if you want to do that yourself, you can. But really important to be 100% sure that you are non-resident for tax purposes, because if you are in the US long enough to be considered resident, then you would be taxable on your worldwide income and it would be reportable. Now, if you're unsure if you're resident or non-resident, just go in and complete step 1 on Sprintax. We'll work that out for you. Once you provide the details of your entry and exit dates, your visas, your visa history and so on, we will work all of that out for you, and at least then you'll be 100% sure. Which next dates for this year we also have to pay taxes. So I suppose each year, like the tax year is the same as the calendar year. So at the moment we're looking at the 2023 tax year, and we're looking at any income that you've earned, any tax that was withheld on that income, and any days that you've spent in the US. And that's between January 1st and December 31st, 2023. Then the tax filing deadline this year is April 15th. So the tax filing deadline to submit your taxes is always going to be the April of the following year. So anything you earn this year, this calendar year, 2024, you will need to submit in your tax return next year. And the deadline will be normally the 15th of April, unless that falls on a weekend or a bank holiday or public holiday or whatever, and then it will move to the next working day, but generally around the 15th of April for the previous year. Is filing through Sprintax website free? So I suppose most of you on today's session, you know, your visa agent or sponsor, your employer, you know, they will likely have a partnership with Sprintax in which they will send you information by email with information about accessing Sprintax. So they'll give you a link and a code to access Sprintax. So I definitely have a look to see if you've received anything from your agent, your sponsor, your host family, your employer, whatever the case may be. If they have partnered with Sprintax, they will give you, like I said, a link to access Sprintax and a code that you will use at checkout. If you've got a code, it will either cover the full federal or Form 8843 fee for you, or it'll provide a discount on that federal filing fee, depending on the partnership that they've got. So definitely worth checking your emails, see have you received anything there about accessing Sprintax. If not, you can just visit the Sprintax webpage. You can just click on personal and returns, create your account, we'll guide you through the process, and you just pay the fee then yourself at checkout if you don't have a code that covers it. Now, just in terms of the costs for a federal preparation, the fee is $51.95. But like I said, do check to see if you have a code, because the code will either remove that fee in full or it'll remove $5 from that fee, depending on the partnership that your agent or your sponsor, for example, have. If you trigger a state filing requirement, the fee to prepare a state return is $44.95, and that's something that you will generally pay yourself. That's generally not covered by your agent or your sponsor. Hi, I don't live in the United States and I don't plan to go back for a while. Can I get my tax return sent abroad? So yeah, absolutely. Like, you can use Sprintax from anywhere in the world, anytime, day or night. It's an online service. You just log in, provide the information we need. We'll prepare the relevant forms for you. Then it's just a case of downloading, printing, signing, and physically mailing those documents. Now, you can do that from anywhere in the world. Obviously, if you're doing it from outside the US, we would say allow yourself a little more time, you know, for your documents to arrive at the IRS or the State Department before that April 15th deadline. So if you're doing it outside the US, do it as soon as you can. Just get it in the mail. At least then you know it's done and you don't need to be worrying about it. I received Form 1095C. Can I also use Sprintax to file? So you're not going to need Form 1095C on your non-resident tax return. It's not something that's going to be relevant to you for your taxes. But if you've received 1095A, then that can certainly be included, and Sprintax will guide you through that process there. We'll be able to include that for you. Hi, I'm sorry for being late. If I arrived on October 5th last year, which document do I need? So you arrived on October 5th. It depends on whether you've received income or not during the year. So from the 5th of October to the 31st of December. If you didn't receive any income, you just need to submit Form 8843. You won't have received any income documents in that case. You just go through Sprintax. We'll prepare Form 8843 for you. If you did receive income after you arrived, so between the 5th of October and the 31st of December, you will trigger a federal filing requirement and you will have received income documents. So it depends on your situation. So no, we're almost up to time, and I know there's lots of questions there, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everything. I know we answered a lot in the background as we were going through the session as well, but if there's anything that we haven't answered today, please do use that live chat on the Sprintax website. So when you're logged into your Sprintax account, you'll see that, on the bottom right-hand corner of every screen as you go through the questionnaire. You also have access to the Sprintax blog and YouTube channel. So all of your frequently asked questions are covered in either a nice short video on YouTube or a more detailed blog post on the Sprintax blog. So if you just go in, type in your question into either of them, and we'll give you the blog or the video that most closely relates to your question. But maybe one or two more questions before we finish up then. Is there a difference between federal and state tax, and do we file separately? So yes, there is, absolutely. So I suppose everyone on today's session, you need to do something when it comes to federal taxes, minimum being that form 8843. But not everybody will trigger a state filing requirement. As I said, state tax rules differ from state to state. If you didn't earn any income at all and it's just form 8843 you need to file, you won't trigger a state filing requirement in that case. Or if your income is under a certain level, for example, and again, that varies from state to state, but not everybody will trigger a state filing requirement. They would be filed separately. So Sprintax will prepare the documents for you. You just need to go through Sprintax that one time, provide the information that we need there. We'll prepare all relevant forms for you, but your federal and your state forms will be sent to different addresses. And last question then, hi, how can we receive the recording? So we will follow up with everybody later. You'll all receive an email to the email address that you use to register for this session. You'll get an email with a link to today's webinar recording. So you will be able to go back over anything in more detail if needed. But thank you everybody for coming along. Thanks so much for the engagement and for all the questions coming through. It's lovely to see so many of you on. But I suppose just to say that, I know as a J1 visa holder, this may be your first time submitting tax returns in the US, and it may seem kind of scary, kind of daunting, but it's not as bad as what it may seem. Once you sit down to prepare your taxes and you're going through Sprintax, it's very straightforward, but it is really important that you do get it done. It is part of your visa conditions. It's something that you need to do. But don't worry, just sit down and get started, and we're here to assist with any questions that you've got along the way. That live chat is available 24/7 throughout filing season. Well, thank you again everybody for coming along. Wishing you the very best of luck with your taxes, and enjoy the rest of your day.